Carnism teaches us how not to feel. What carnism does is it blocks our awareness of what psychologists refer to as cognitive moral dissonance. Cognitive moral dissonance is the internal moral discomfort we feel when our values are not in alignment with our practices. When it comes to eating animals, clearly there's a conflict here. And I want to share with you a quote from one of my research participants, a carnist, who I've been talking very comfortably about the different types of food she eats and prepares. And when I asked her about eating meat, she got emotional. And here's an excerpt of what she said to me. I mean, there are so many mortifying things in our culture and society, but killing animals for food certainly is one of the worst. And people ignore it the most because they think that animals don't matter. I feel a lot for these animals. Just the thought is really upsetting. I'm crying. And she started to cry. She was talking to me. When we experience cognitive moral dissonance, it's a discomfort, and we seek to alleviate it. And in order to do this, we have three choices. We can either change our self-concept. We can change our core value system. What this means is we can say, yeah, I suck. I'm a bad person, I don't care about animals, and, so be it, I'm evil. And research shows us that this is not going to happen to 99% of the people, and I don't know why they needed to conduct research on this, but we do have empirical evidence to show that everybody needs to believe that they're living a moral life. We all need to feel this way. So if we're not going to change our self-concept, what can we change? What do you think? Well, one thing you can change is your behavior, and in this case it would mean you can stop eating animals and there's no more conflict. But as you probably know, most people do not do this. And so there's a third option, which is to change our perception of our behavior, and it's around this third option that carnism is organized. This is the mentality of me. Now, I have told you that carnism uses social and psychological defenses to maintain itself. The primary defense of the system is invisibility. And the primary way it stays invisible is by remaining unnamed. If we don't name it, we can't talk about it. We can't talk about it, we can't question it, we can't challenge it. Like I've said, meat eating seems like a given rather than a choice, just the way things are. But carnism also maintains invisibility by keeping the victims of the system out of sight and conveniently out of public consciousness. And there are many different groups of invisible victims. The first group, most of, if not all of you, are aware of here, and don't worry, there's no gore in this presentation. I actually saved that for the presentations I give to carnists. They need to see it, you don't. Is the non-human victims. 10 billion non-human victims every year. This is land animals alone, not even including fish and others. I just couldn't resist. I don't know how this happened. And I think it's even a golden retriever. I guess we all have our preferences, right? That little chick looks so jealous. I'm projecting. And of course, our environment is an invisible victim. In 2007, the UN issued a report stating that animal agriculture is one of the most significant contributors to the most serious environmental problems facing the world today. Carnism is a system of victimization. It victimizes all of us, everyone, everything on the planet. Slaughterhouse workers and meat packers, most of whom are non-English speaking immigrants, legal or illegal, who have to work in a highly dangerous, death-saturated environment day in and day out, and not surprisingly have high rates of addiction and post-traumatic stress, are also victims of the system. And a couple of titles of federal OSHA accident reports, I took 2 out of maybe 50 that I had, Give you an idea of what they have to deal with for the people sitting in the back. One of them is employee hospitalized for neck laceration from flying blade. Employee's arm amputated when caught in meat tenderizer. And again, I saved the worst of these for the carnists, so you can imagine. And in fact, in 2005, for the first time ever, Human Rights Watch issued a report criticizing a single U.S. industry, the meat industry, for working conditions so appalling they violate basic human rights. And we are the invisible victims of carnism. Whether we're vegan, vegetarian today, most of us grew up eating animals, and most people continue to eat animals. We pay for carnism with our health, as animal products consumption has been connected with the leading diseases in the Western world and leading pandemic flus. We pay for carnism with our taxes, $7.64 billion per year to be exact, in meat subsidies, subsidies that have been criticized across the political spectrum as one of the most egregious corporate welfare programs in the history of the country. And we pay for carnism with our hearts and with our minds. Because in order to eat other animals, we have to disconnect. We have to shut down our empathy and block our awareness. And empathy and awareness are integral to our sense of self. But invisibility can only protect us so much. You know, the system, hints of the truth surround us. For instance, the resilient vein in the drumstick, vegetarian guests at dinner parties, the hog on a spit at a company barbecue, and an endless supply of dead animals everywhere we turn in the form of meat. So when invisibility inevitably falters, the system needs a backup. It needs to teach us to justify eating animals. Now, there's a vast mythology surrounding meat, but all of these myths fall in one way or another under what I refer to as the 3 N's of justification, and many of you in this room are probably all too painfully familiar with these. What do you think they are?
Natural.
Natural. You've probably heard it all before many, many times. Eating meat is normal, natural, and necessary. And, perhaps not surprisingly, these same myths have been used to justify violent ideologies throughout the course of human history. For the people in the back, slavery, male dominance, heterosexual supremacy. One myth is so particularly resilient that I just couldn't help mentioning it. The protein myth. And, as we know, this is myth. I rest my case. But the myths of meat persist despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. And this is because the system is so entrenched. When a system is entrenched, it's embraced and maintained by all of the major social institutions, from the family to the state. And I'm going to use a quote from a 19th century French political economist that I think sums this up quite well. When plunder becomes a way of life for a group of men and women living together in society, they create for themselves, in the course of time, a legal system that authorizes it and a moral code that glorifies it. And when we're born into an entrenched system, we inevitably absorb the system's logic as our own. We internalize carnism. We learn to see the world through the lens of carnism. And carnism teaches us to think and feel in certain ways that distance us from our emotions and distort our perceptions of meat and the animals that we eat so we can feel comfortable enough to consume them. For example, it teaches us to see animals as objects. So we refer to this chicken as something rather than someone. It's a lot easier to eat something than it is to eat someone. Or we call this little lamb it, a thing, rather than he or she. Carnism Carnism teaches us to see animals as abstractions, as lacking in any individuality. We see them as nothing more than abstract members of a generalized group about which we've made stereotypical assumptions. A pig is a pig and all pigs are the same. Like other victims of violent ideologies, we give them numbers rather than names. And a good example of this is another quote from my doctoral research from a meat cutter who said to me, "I don't think of farmed animals as individuals. I wouldn't be able to do my job if I got that personal with them." When you say individuals, you mean as a unique person, as a unique thing with its own name and its own characteristics, its own little games that it plays? Yeah? Yeah, I'd really rather not know that. I'm sure it has it, but I'd rather not know it. Carnism teaches us to place animals in rigid categories in our minds so that we can harbor very different emotions toward different species and afford them a very different level of moral concern. And this is exemplified in a quote from a carnist I interviewed who told me quite openly that she eats all different types of meats. I was going through my checklist, you eat this, this, and this. When I got to veal, she paused and she responded, "Well, let's just say I came to your house and you told me that I had just eaten veal. I'd probably vomit. Like, I have to get that out of my system." And she made some heaving sounds that I couldn't figure out how to include in here. And when we look at the world through the eyes of carnism, we fail to see the absurdities of the system. We see somebody selling themselves, carving themselves up, happily beseeching the viewer to eat them. We fail to see the horror. We fail to see the insanity of the system. But there is good news, and the good news is that we care. People care. Carnists care. Yes, even carnists care. I've been speaking and teaching about meat production for nearly 2 decades, and I have never once come across a single person who doesn't cringe when faced with images of animals suffering. We care about animals and we care about the truth, and carnism depends on our not caring, and the system is based on deception. The carnism it's a house of cards. It's a fractured and fragmented system that needs a strong fortress to protect itself from its very own proponents. And why else would people need to go through such mental gymnastics to eat animals, if not because they care? And history shows us again and again that when we make that connection, when we close the gap in our consciousness, that we are willing to stand up and fight against all forms of cruelty and injustice. So, moving beyond carnism, it requires that we bear witness, as all of you have chosen to do. Bearing witness means being willing to see the truth with our eyes as well as with our hearts. And if you think about it, throughout the history of humankind, virtually every atrocity has been made possible because a populace turned away from a reality that they felt was too painful to face. And virtually every revolution, every social transformation was made possible because a group of people chose to bear witness and demanded that others bear witness as well. When we bear witness, we close that gap in our consciousness. We become more integrated, and integration is the goal, according to many psychological and spiritual traditions, the goal of human development. Integration between body, mind, spirit, id, ego, superego, self and other, personal and political. Perhaps not surprisingly, it shares a root with the word integrity, which by definition is the integration of values and practices. So moving beyond carnism requires that we have a paradigm shift, a whole shift of the way that we think about and see the world. It requires that we move from a society, a system of dishonesty, to authenticity, from apathy to empathy, from mindlessness to mindfulness, from complacency to compassion, and from ignorance to awareness. So clearly, carnism and veganism or vegetarianism have very different goals. The goal of carnistic industry is to maintain carnistic numbing. And the goal of vegetarian or vegan advocacy is to transform numbing to witnessing. The whole system of carnism is organized to prevent witnessing on an individual level as well as on a social level. So our question, is how can we be active, effective witnesses and get others to do this as well? And as you probably all figured out, we can't force somebody to change. But we certainly can create an environment which increases the likelihood that our message will be heard the way that we've intended it to. So I'm going to briefly go over some strategies to talk about ways that we can do this. One important fact is to not expect the facts to sell the ideology. So often we think, if only the carnists knew the truth, they'd never be able to eat meat or animals again. But as you may be all too well aware, more often than not, this is not the case. And we can find ourselves frustrated, exasperated, wondering what kind of a psychopath we're dealing with. And then we end up pushing harder with the facts and the truth. What happens to you when you push harder? They push back. It increases carnistic defenses. Expect defensiveness. The system is organized around defenses. So we need to be careful to speak to the carnist, not to his or her defenses. It's so easy for us, for instance, to get caught up in a battle of justifications with our, what ifs and yes buts. Well, what if you had to kill the animal yourself? Would you eat meat then? Or, well, yes, but we wouldn't have to worry about what to do with all the animals if everyone went vegan because we wouldn't be breeding them in the first place. Some justifications we need to address. If somebody really believes they're going to sicken and die without their meat, well then they need to be made aware that that's not going to happen. But we have to remember that carnism is it's a system of victimization pitting us against them in a divide and conquer strategy that works against all of us. I mean, the goal of the vegan movement is to attract a critical mass of supporters. And there's no way that we can do that if we see the very people we're reaching out to as the enemy. So we need to recognize that carnism is this psychological system that we're dealing with, a mindset. And so we need to appreciate that asking someone to stop eating meat is not simply asking for a change of behavior, but for a shift of consciousness. We're asking a person to start thinking of themselves as a strand in the web of life, rather than standing atop the so-called hierarchical ladder of life. We're asking them to risk being marginalized or ostracized from their friends and family. We're asking them to open up to the reality of the overwhelming animal suffering in this world. And once you really take in that truth, your life is never the same. Your innocence is lost. You carry that awareness around with you wherever you go. Being vegan or vegetarian is in many ways tremendously empowering, but it is also it also makes us outsiders in other ways. We have to live in a world where we're constantly misunderstood, where every single day our deepest sensibilities are offended. We can start to dread family get-togethers that we used to look forward to. I've seen relationships fall apart, and this doesn't have to happen, but I have seen it happen. So it's very important for us to remember that people don't change unless they're psychologically ready to. Not just saying stop eating meat, we're saying change your life in some pretty fundamental ways. Take some real risks. Now, we can't create a psychological readiness in a person's life, but we can create a psychological environment that helps them feel safe enough to communicate with us. And one way we do this is to practice separating character from behavior. In other words, we can think of eating animals as something bad, as something evil. It doesn't make the person doing it bad or evil. Your character is beyond just your behavior. Good people do bad things all the time. Many carnists are loving fathers and sisters and brothers and daughters. They're great humanitarians. They're community leaders. They're spiritual teachers. So we need to remember good people can do and do bad things. If we don't remember this, we can fall into the trap of what I refer to as reductive thinking. Reductive thinking is when we reduce a person in our mind to nothing more than a behavior or a set of behaviors. And if you've ever driven in Boston, this happens in about 30 seconds when you get on the road. That person who inevitably cuts you off the minute you're in your car is no longer a person who has a life that matters to them, who has loved and lost and grieved and laughed. They're just that jerk driver on the road. When it comes to relating to carnists, we often do this psychologically, automatically, especially if we're dining with them. We can transform them in our minds from this to this. So we need to appreciate that, view carnists as individuals first, to not reduce somebody to simply, to not, let somebody's carnism define them. They're more than their carnism. I'm more than my veganism. I'm a vegan. My life is very much organized around my veganism, but that's not all of who I am. That's only a part of who I am. And as a vegan, like many of you, I have much more in common with many carnists than I do with many vegans and vegetarians. So we also need to be careful not to internalize carnism. Now, all of you here, to some degree, probably a large degree, have stepped outside of this system. But because it's the dominant system, we can't avoid its impact. It's sort of like becoming aware of advertising. Like me, I teach classes on consumerism, and I'm wearing Gap. I mean, it still affects your self-image. So carnism still impacts us. So don't buy into the negative messages that you hear about yourself. That you're, for instance, overly emotional, which is, number one, it's a thinly veiled insult, suggesting, well, you're not rational, you're irrational, too emotional, irrational. These are often carnistic defenses, which are ways of discrediting the vegan-vegetarian message. If you shoot the messenger, you don't have to take the implications of their message seriously. The emotions of grief and sorrow and anger and fear and sadness and despair that arise when you take in the reality of animal suffering in this world are helpful, appropriate, legitimate responses to the truth of what's happening. They're the opposite of numbing. We need to not allow ourselves to be pathologized. Something's wrong with you. As soon as I get sick, people in my family, oh, well, it's because of your diet. My brother who eats meat, they don't ever say that. Oh, you're not sleeping enough? My family doesn't do this anymore because I forced them all to read my book, but it used to happen all the time. There wasn't personal motivation. So typically, a young woman who goes vegetarian will, first thing a psychologist will think is, oh, maybe this is a mask for an eating disorder, rather than maybe this is a sign of maturity, where she's becoming more integrated. We need to not be accused of being picky eaters, being called hypocrites or extremists. You're a hypocrite if you wear leather, or you're an extremist if you don't, or anti-human. So ultimately, moving beyond carnism requires all of us, carnists, vegans, and vegetarians alike, to become the change that we wish to see in the world, as said by Mahatma Gandhi. Thank you. 8 minutes for Q&A.
Oh, hey, thank you for this. I'm Carrie Freeman from Georgia State University. This is such smart and very useful information. And I was thinking, I like the concentration on ideology, and with carnism, could it also be expanded to the ideology of humanism? That if you expand it out to why why we also wear fur and experiment on animals and that kind of thing, and that not that we need to be anti-human, but we should be now we're in a post-humanist era.
Yeah. That's a great question. And I think what you're really saying is carnism connected to speciesism, which is the broader ism based on human supremacy.
Yes.
And yes, it absolutely is. Two quick answers to what you're saying. Carnism is structurally similar to all violent ideologies perpetrated against humans and non-humans in a variety of ways. So it can certainly help our understanding in general. Having said that, we can think of carnism as sort of a sub-ideology of speciesism. Just as, for instance, anti-Semitism is a sub-ideology of racism. So my hope is that by raising awareness of carnism, carnists, and I speak to lots of groups of carnists, are much more likely to hear a message that's directed at one specific behavior, and it happens to be a behavior that impacts people intimately and that causes more animal suffering than all of the other behaviors in the world combined. Then we can really ultimately expand this to talk about speciesism and human supremacy.
Hi, my name is Steve from Toronto, Canada, and thanks for your speech. It was great, and you were talking about the shift of consciousness and separating the character from the behavior and the psychologically readiness. And my challenge is, how long do we need to wait for psychologically readiness? And I know it's a very challenging answer, but
Do you mean in one individual or in the world?
individual.
In an individual. How long do you wait for somebody to make that change? Create the space for them to move into with the change in a way that feels safe for them. And there's no answer to that. People change when they're ready and not before. I became vegetarian at 23. The information had been out there beforehand. I had been exposed to it. I know that I had. But I wasn't ready to make the change. And so there's no, you wait for as long as you can tolerate waiting. And if you can in the process, not feel like you're waiting, but accept a person for where they're at, you'll probably increase the chances of them making the change faster. One more thing I forgot to mention, carnism.com now goes to my website. We are starting, a group of activists are starting an organization called CAN, Carnism Awareness and Action Network. We really want to get this word and this concept out there into people who are in these movements to begin with, and then out there into the public. We're going to be giving suggestions of ways that people can help us raise awareness, and also tips for people who want to be able to use this in their everyday life, this information. Okay, I think we're out of questions and we're just about out of time, so that's perfect. Well, thank you again.